we let the floor immediately to Alta, and we will have 10 minutes of question at the end of your both talks, your two talks.
Thanks very much. Let me just pull up some slides here for you. First, that was a wonderful segue. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Hervé. It feels like meeting with old friends from old committees here. I wanted to speak directly to what's currently going on and what may happen next, specifically on governance questions. So as Eric was just saying, it's important to begin with a recognition that there really is no mechanism for unified policy or global governance in this area. There are some exceptions in the form of regional agreements, such as the Oviedo Convention, which was developed under the auspices of the Council of Europe, as well as treaties or other formal instruments. But these really are representing only a minority of the countries around the world. And in addition, even once these exist, they still need to be translated into domestic policy through domestic law in most cases. And as we know, countries can have reservations or other kinds of exceptions made to their compliance with these. And so it would not be realistic to rely entirely on these mechanisms to try and achieve some kind of global rationality with regard to this field, because I don't think that uniformity is either possible or necessarily the right goal. If you want to get a sense of what's going on around the world, the Genetic Literacy Project has a wonderful website where you can actually click on any country and take a look at what its current rules might be, and it is kept fairly up to date. So in addition to Professor Bayless's recent article documenting what is currently known about law in these various countries, this allows you to do a kind of ongoing update. The other thing that's interesting here is that you get a chance to look not only at human and health, which would cover things like stem cell and germline gene editing questions, but you can also compare it to the attitudes around gene drives or agriculture in the form of genetically engineered foods and genetically engineered animals. And it's useful to do that sometimes in order to try to better appreciate what the underlying driving forces are, politically speaking, in any one country. In some countries, it seems like it's really about anything having to do with genetics in particular, often having to do with a very particularized history. Germany is an example of a country that is still working through the trauma of the mid-20th century experience with the Nazis, making it particularly cautious about genetic technologies. And then you get other countries where really, such as in the United States, it's more about a religious conflict and about changing demography in terms of religiosity and secularism, in which case the focus will be more on the human health applications, but much less controversy around some of the environmental applications. And this can be helpful in trying to predict where the policy will go. Understanding what the underlying forces are in any particular country is a good place to start. But let's take a close look at least one example of global governance, which is the Oviedo Convention, which really aimed to say that you basically cannot do anything that's going to intentionally introduce a modification that will be heritable. This is something that is very specific and fairly narrow in its focus, but it has had some real influence. So one of the results is that in countries that are partners to this, you have a highly regulated situation, and with germline in particular, completely illegal. The UK's exit from the European Union will open up new questions about whether the UK is going to go in a different direction from the rest of the continent, politically as well as legally. In China, what we discovered is that we have very unclear regulation. There are a series of laws in China that have to do with human reproduction and stem cells that are of overlapping coverage, but don't create a comprehensive framework for germline editing or for any kind of editing. We also learned that although there is oversight of human subjects research in China, it's very disorganized. You have literally thousands of individual research oversight committees. at institutions and in regional provinces, but there's very weak control at the national level. And there is a wide variation in the understanding of the applicable rules, if there are any applicable rules, as among these different research oversight committees. And the result is that you have widely varying notions about what is acceptable from place to place in China, as well as many places where research can fall through the cracks and not be completely overseen by any one committee at all. The US has a system in which we have a very highly regulated area for somatic editing under the usual rules for cell and gene therapy. They go through pre-market clinical trials. They have to be approved by a federal agency, and only then can they be marketed. And then there are restrictions on how one can market them based on what they are proven to be safe and effective for. In the area of germline regulation, although Francoise has characterized the US as saying it's illegal, I think that's a little bit misleading. Because of some of the limitations on federal power in the US, it is quite common that instead of saying something is illegal or illegal, is legal or illegal, the federal government will simply say, if you're going to take federal money, then you can or cannot do certain things. And so through the power of the purse, as we say, the power of money, you can place conditions on what people can do. And where federal money is really the primary source of research funding, that can effectively occupy the field, but it is not technically making something illegal. In our case here, through reasons of technicality, what's happened is that we have a budget provision that prevents the federal agency from reviewing and giving approval to any kind of clinical testing of germline editing. And so for the moment, you cannot do it here, but the moment that budget restriction is removed, it now becomes again a situation in which germline editing is legal, speaking from the federal point of view, and is subject to state laws for more regional regulation. And we're all familiar with what happened in November of 2018 when we had this announcement out of China of the use of germline editing on several embryos, and that there had been the birth of 2 children who had been conceived with edited embryos. As it turned out, neither of them got exactly the edit that was intended, which is precisely one of the things people feared, because we could not be sure exactly what condition had been created, and we've not had any real public follow-up of this. China has announced that it plans to tighten up its regulations, and its investigation of this particular situation did reveal that it was done outside the bounds of permissible law. But it's worth noting that the law was so unclear that in the end, what Dr. He Jiankui wound up being convicted of was not violation of a research law or a reproductive technologies law. He was convicted of practicing medicine without a license, which says something about the confusion and lack of comprehensiveness of the law in China. So where has this led us? It has led us now to a situation in which we have many different organizations, as Eric was saying, and most recently, the International Commission on the Clinical Use of Human Germline Genome Editing, which was organized by the US National Academies and the Royal Society, but had input from academies of science and medicine in France and Germany and Japan and other countries. It focused on a very narrow question that came out of the Hong Kong meeting. It was this: we are not going to assume that this is going to be legal everywhere. We assume, in fact, it will be legal and illegal in different countries at different times. But if there's any country on the planet where this is going to be legal, then the next question is, how do you make it responsible? How do you do it in a way that meets ethical and scientific norms and can be done without imposing great harm on people in the future? I don't want to spend too much time on them, but I do want to note that their focus was primarily scientific, looking at specifically what kind of research you need to have in the laboratory models, in the animal models, in order to be able to predict the effectiveness and the safety of any particular edit, the stability of an edit over time, and the risks of unintended effects. So they were focusing primarily on science, but they also had a bit of a walk into the terrain of governance as they tried to explain what kind of oversight would be needed to make sure that this science is being done. So their recommendations at the end, many of them not terribly surprising. For one thing, that we are nowhere close to being at a point where this germline editing could ever be done properly and responsibly, even if it were legal someplace. And so they actually replicated some of the recommendations coming out of earlier commissions about the need to limit this in the future, if it's ever done, to areas where the need is compelling so that it can possibly justify what residual risk exists after the scientific research has been done. They made a number of comments about the capacities of a regulatory body to actually review work and then follow it up over time. And then most interestingly, because Eric said we don't have an international science court, they did talk about something that would be functionally an advisory group on a global scale to advise on the state of the science with regard to germline editing and feed that information on an ongoing basis to any policymakers deciding whether this should be legal, and if so, how it should be regulated. That committee does, in fact, feed into the World Health Organization committee that Hervé and I are currently serving on. Its focus is broader. It's looking at somatic as well as germline editing. It started with this notion that we should be in a position to know what's going on. You cannot do good policy without good facts. And so the first step was to start taking advantage of international clinical trial registries to find out, at least in the area of somatic editing, what's going on because of the need to be able to track some of its more controversial uses, including potential use for so-called enhancement, which, subject to another discussion, is very difficult to define. Ultimately, we want this registry to also collect information about germline editing so that we're not caught by surprise by people like Hervé Chneiweiss or by the people in Russia who have announced that they're interested in doing this, or in Saudi Arabia. But more importantly, I think that the WHO committee is looking not only across borders at the possibility that different countries will have different policies that must be coordinated, and not only that it's looking at somatic therapy for enhancement. I'll talk very briefly at the end about in utero and epigenetic editing, but it is noting that there are special problems precisely because this is a transnational issue. How do we anticipate the movement of patients and scientists across borders? And how do we avoid recreating what happened in stem cell research, where some countries were so poorly regulated that a number of clinics could advertise services that frankly were never proven to be safe or effective, and draw patients from all over the world, so-called stem cell tourism. Here we worried about it becoming gene editing tourism. At the same time, countries were sometimes regulating what their scientists could do, and yet they needed to move across borders to have freedom to collaborate. We also are looking beyond formal regulation, which is only one part of governance. We're also looking at the broader ecosystem that includes journal editors that insist upon evidence of ethical review before publishing materials. We're looking at the role of insurers who evaluate risk and will often stop activities from occurring because they simply refuse to insure them against liability for having caused injury. We're looking at the role of professional societies, not only to educate and advise their members, but potentially to be a place where people who have concerns about work in another laboratory, like Hervé Chneiweiss, have a place to go and report their concerns and provide a venue to discuss those concerns. When we look into the future, I think it's important to recognize that somatic editing is really where the action is going to be at. Germline editing, even if proven to be safe and effective, will be used for very few things. But somatic editing has many more interesting possibilities. Enhancement to make somebody pain resistant if they have terminal cancer is wonderful, but it also could be used to make military people more resistant to pain, which might be a little bit concerning. We can look at somatic editing of the fetus in the uterus, which may turn out to be very helpful for multi-system conditions, but immediately abortion law is going to become a big factor. And so we need to recognize kind of the dual uses of these things and the way they fit into other aspects of our law while we try to anticipate creating a coordination as opposed to harmonization of global law. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, both of you, for this very comprehensible and very large view that you gave us of the issues on one side and the possibilities of governance on the other side. I think that we have already several questions. I'm going to start with one who is coming from Didier Courneuil, who is from the transhumanist French movement and is questioning the Oviedo Convention. What is, and challenging this Oviedo Convention, wondering why, if it could be possible to have healthier life, would it be not allowed to make that available for our descendants? Eric, you want to comment first? Eric, you have to activate your mic.
It's a great question. I think Alta alluded to it as well, and she may want to comment on the convention. This is not one of those, yes, you're right, no, you're wrong questions. Clearly, the perspective that has been guiding not just genomics, but research involving human participants for decades has been that challenge of risk and benefit. What are the opportunities that can enhance well-being, where the word enhance becomes a somewhat loaded term, enhance to make someone beyond the capacity of normal human functioning is what gives people a pause. But the idea of being able to allow science to help, to heal, and to prevent harm are principles that I think are included in that list that I provided at the end of my presentation. The devil obviously is in the details of what would be permitted. I will want to say one more thing, because this may sound like a bit of an ambiguous answer. Most of what we talk about is responsibility within the context of rational deliberation by governments and society. And I'm perfectly content to live in a world where there are some societies who wish to be more progressive in their pursuit of science to help their community, and those that may be more modest in their pursuit. That is within a large universe of rational deliberation. Where it becomes concerning are those who are at the sort of tail end of that curve, who intentionally wish to use technology, not simply to help human well-being, but to take advantage of the power of technology over humanity. And that's where, of course, the worrisome risks of not only narcissistic behavior, but overt militaristic use of technology raises those concerns. The flip side, at the other end of the curve, are those who are Luddites with respect to the capacity of science and technology to help and to heal.
Thank you, Eric. Alta, you want to have some comments on this?
I would, but actually I think it's more important to let other people speak. So let's keep going.
Okay.
There's another question.
So, Alta, maybe some precision or remark Françoise Baylis is making on YouTube, because you said that you spoke of certain US regulation. She's wondering about the US Further Consolidated Appropriation Act 2020. Right. Omnibus spending bill contains one provision that restricts federal funding of human embryo research. And she's mentioning also the US FDA that cannot consider applications for clinical trials involving heritable human genome editing. So it seems that maybe you should be just a precision on the US law,
sure.
or what you say.
Yeah, and as I said, I thought that her characterization of the US as having this germline editing illegal was slightly misleading because it's not germline editing per se that's illegal. It is a related issue, which is the spending of money on germline editing. That's the budget bill that she mentioned, that the FDA is not allowed to spend its time, because that represents money, on reviewing an application to begin a clinical trial. Those budget appropriations bills go through a process every 2 years. So it has to be renewed every 2 years for that particular restriction to stay in place. Whether it'll be removed or not, I don't know. Until it's removed, you cannot pursue germline editing legally, but it's not the germline editing that is the issue so much as it is the funding, the budgeting. On the other, the embryo research, that's a long-standing restriction on the use of federal money to do research that uses human embryos. You can absolutely do research on human embryos using private money or money from about 45 of the 50 states that don't have any restriction on that. So as I was saying, the US is peculiar because the federal system of limited federal powers means we often indirectly affect things without actually saying that they're legal or illegal. And it just makes it hard to explain, and probably not all that interesting for most people around the world.
No, it's something that we could continue and illustrate with the COVID crisis, because, for example, Pfizer is explaining the high price of the vaccine because they didn't want to use the federal funding, and
exactly.
Whereas others are explaining they will make the vaccine very cheap because they use federal funding. I have a question, maybe you could continue, of Emmanuel Sebag. Is it realistic to aim at fully harmonized policies? All technology rely on local policies. So what is different with gene editing, and which topics do we want to agree at on a global level?
Eric?
Me or Alta? How about I start? Because I think I was the one who used harmonized. And at the moment I said it, I realized I probably should have put it in quotation marks. And I rather like Alta's term of coordinated. Harmonized, not to push the musical metaphor, raises a few issues because it suggests that there is literally one level of agreement that can occur. At least that's the perspective that some might have. I'm rather open to the idea of as I alluded to earlier, I don't know if I would call it local in response to Emmanuel's comment. And hello, Emmanuel, glad to know that you're online. But rather, how do we accommodate the issues and interests of jurisdictions that have every right to decide how permissive or restrictive they wish to be? What I would like to see, if it were, in my power, is to have everyone participate in this discussion, to have every jurisdiction have a say in how they wish to either regulate, permit, promote, encourage, or even prohibit an actual technology. Where it becomes challenging, of course, is that the world is not made up of geographic maps where technology ends at one border and will never leap over that particular fence into another country or state or province's backyard. So harmonization, which I know is a technical term in law and policy, is more of a philosophic concept that I was suggesting. So do I agree that an individual state may wish to limit? Absolutely, they should. There will be consequences for any decision that a jurisdiction takes, whether it's permissive or restrictive.
Thank you. Alta, just a word. We have still 2 minutes.
So I'm going to be very brief. I think that we should celebrate the fact that the world is filled with countries that have very diverse cultures that balance risk and benefit very differently. Some that would say that any possible risk to the future should be avoided, even if it means we sacrifice today. And others who say, I want to see everybody today live as well as they can, and I'm optimistic that technology will improve to handle problems if they occur in the future. These are legitimate value differences. We have countries that are pro-natalist and countries that are anti-natalist. These are legitimate value differences. And the only way that we can actually experience all ways of living is to, in fact, celebrate the fact that you can go different places and live different ways. I look for coordination so that we don't obstruct one another and that we don't export injury to one another, but at the same time, not expect that everybody be the same.
Yes, and Thank you so much, because if we want to have this multicultural view and allow each of these views to have the floor and the place, we need organizations such as ARRIGE, where the dialogue and where the variant views can be expressed and coordinated in some aspect. And it's really one of the fundamental mission of ARRIGE to foster this dialogue and to continue the discussion, as you said, Eric, that it was just a milestone. And with Alta, we will have 5 principles on the way to view human genome editing governance. And we hope we will continue this conversation, because obviously it's a dynamic process, and ARRIGE will be here in January, but also next year to continue the